And now let's turn to our very important discussion and a timely program. It gives me great pleasure to briefly introduce our moderator and our two panelists. There are fuller bios online, so this is just a snippet of how marvelous and great everyone is. Michael Weisberg is Senior Faculty Fellow and Director of Postgraduate Programs at Perry-Wohlthaus, as well as Bess W. Heyman President's Professor and Chair of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. He serves as Editor-in-Chief of Biology and Philosophy, Advisor to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's Nairobi Work Program, and directs Penn campus-wide interdisciplinary research in Galapagos. He is the author of Simulation and Similarity, Using Models to Understand the World, and Galapagos, Life in Motion, as well as a contributing author to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and Sixth Assessment Report. And one thing you'll note before I even finish these bios is that none of the people on stage or online sleep, as you can see from all that they've achieved. A Penn alum, Mauricio Rodas started his professional career with the UN's Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. In 2007, he founded and served as the executive director of Ethos Public Policy Lab, a think tank based in Mexico. In 2011, he returned to Ecuador and founded SUMA, a national political party, and was elected mayor of Quito, where he served until 2019, and in that capacity hosted the UN's Conference on Urban Sustainable Development, also known as Habitat 3. He is a visiting fellow in many places, is a shared fellow with Penn IUR, the Climate Center at Perry-Wohlthaus. He's been working diligently on lots of issues, including C2IFI, which is Cities Climate Resilience Infrastructure Financing Initiative, and extreme heat, which you will hear about. Last but certainly not least is Koko Warner, who is also a Perry-Wohlthaus Fellow. She focuses on climate risk and impacts, migration, and resilience futures at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. She manages the Vulnerability Subdivision, where she guides the UN Climate Secretariat's Adaptation Knowledge Hub and the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. Warner is a lead author for the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land and Fifth Assessment Report. Previously at UNFCCC, she supervised the loss and damage workstream. So it gives me great pleasure to turn the floor over to Michael to begin our wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, LaShawn. Thank you all for being here today. Those of you in person, those of you online, it's really a pleasure to see you. Koko, it's lovely to see you. We were just together, but to see you on the screen again is very nice. Thanks for being with us in your evening. So as you all know, over the last 2 weeks, really wrapping up only on Saturday, delegates from nearly 200 countries worked within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in Glasgow, Scotland, at what's the COP26, or the 26th Conference of the Parties. The larger group that was there included diplomats, scientists, academic experts, NGO representatives, and 15 members of the University of Pennsylvania community. Those were drawn from Perry-Wohlthaus, but also from the Climate Center for Energy Policy and the Penn Institute for Urban Research. So the 40,000 people that were officially registered were dwarfed by the many hundreds of thousands of people that were in the streets, and that is an important part of the narrative of COP26. So I think, as many of you know, COP26 was delayed for a year because of the COVID pandemic, and it really even increased the intensity of the event. It was the 5th COP, however, since the negotiation of the Paris Agreement, and it came on the heels of the first part of the 6th Assessment Report's first volume coming out. So there's an increased urgency in the part of the delegates and also in the part of those that were on the street. And the sense of urgency is really because the clock is ticking. So according to the IPCC, there are 98 months left to have global emissions in order to meet this global goal that's sort of been embraced of trying to keep global mean temperature below 1.5 degrees. So think about that, 98 months to have global emissions. Now, we'll talk through this hour about many different aspects of COP26. The question that the three of us and everybody else who was there have been asked over and over again is, how did it go? Was it a success? And we'll try to walk you through that and answer some of your questions. But I think just before I turn it over to Koko and to Mauricio and ask them some questions, just to kind of give you a sense of how all of this goes, because I think it's a little bit, it's such a kind of complex thing. My cousin, who's been a negotiator for a long time, calls it's a 20-ring circus. And what he means is, at the outer level, there are people protesting on the streets, quite literally. And then a little bit inside of that, there's something that's more like a regular trade show, trade convention. And as you kind of move to the interior, you start to get where people are discussing questions of finance, questions of national priorities when it comes to climate change, sub-national priorities like the priorities of cities. And as you move closer and closer to the inner circle, you get to the kind of core part of the event, what's maybe called the formal negotiations. So when you hear on the news, either COP26 was successful or COP26 was not successful, it was a disappointment, it was great. A lot of what's being discussed is that kind of core part, not so much what happened on the street, not so much the trade shows around it, but really what ultimately was in these texts that were negotiated, these texts which become international law. And just to give you a flavor though, what is being discussed, it's really a couple of things. The first thing is trying to finish some of the remaining business in working out the details of the Paris Agreement. But another part is questions about commitments that countries will make about lowering the greenhouse gas emissions, but also commitments they will make about sending money from the developed world to the developing world, both to help them in their energy transition, but also to try to help them address the adverse effects of climate change, which are already happening. So much of what you might think about COP26, I suppose, has to do with what your expectations might have been, where you think things started, where you think that they got to. And we have with us today two just incredible experts on different aspects of this process. So Koko, who I'll turn to first, as LaShawn mentioned, she works for the UN Climate Secretariat. And that means the part of the UN that supports negotiations and supports all things climate change inside the United Nations. And I'll ask her some questions really about the kind of formal part of the negotiation process. And Mauricio, as you heard, the former mayor of Quito, is also a leader in the movement of cities taking a leadership role in climate change. And this has been a really important development over the last 5 or 10 years as it's increasingly recognized the importance that cities play for this. So Mauricio is going to unfortunately have to be the stand-in, not just for cities, but for all non-national parts of this agreement, cities, regions, corporations, everything else, but we'll focus on cities, of course. But really, hopefully we all understand that it's many different actors here, even if the core formal part of the negotiation, as with all UN processes, is a negotiation of countries to countries. So I hope that gives you some frame of the whole picture. And I want to actually ask the first question to Koko. And I want to ask you, Koko, can you just give us a sense of the big picture? Maybe, if this had been a home run, where would we have got? And then did we strike out? Did we get a double? Koko's American, despite living in Germany. She understands this, what I'm talking about. Really, where did we land? Where could we have gotten? Where did we get? And most importantly, perhaps on the road to the next COP in Egypt in next year, where are we going? So Koko, this is the question everyone's asking. Was it a success? Are we on the track to save the planet?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. And it's just great to be back with Perry World House and wish I could be there in person. I think what most of us are thinking, and probably what a lot of you are hearing, is the outcome was good and it wasn't good enough. So perhaps I could say what was good, a home run. I almost go into magical thinking, which is not involving climate change. Like we're back solidly in the Holocene and climate change has gone away entirely. And we have this beautiful Star Trek-like future ahead. We still have to build that and don't give up on that. But let me tell you what was good about COP26. And again, Michael, I know that you and Mauricio and many, many others from the Kleinman Center and Perry World House and so many of the colleagues from the University of Pennsylvania who participate in the climate negotiations. I know we talk about this a lot, but for some of you youth in the audience and those who might not be as familiar, of course, we have an event, and that just took place over the last 2 or 3 weeks in Glasgow, Scotland. But this is a work in progress. And so a home run would have been, like I said, but the good part is that for our work in progress, we made a lot of achievements. There were major achievements in what we refer to as Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And what that's about are cooperative actions that countries take together in a coordinated way to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So those can be carbon markets, They can be a whole range of other things, also non-market mechanisms. I know that sounds a little technical, and this is a really technical discussion, but we finally got across the threshold with how to proceed with those cooperative measures. That involves share of proceeds for adaptation. Again, maybe we can get into the weeds and details of Article 6, but that was a major thing that we hadn't achieved in the last 5 years. So that was a big achievement. Finance, developed countries committed to double their finance for adaptation, let alone the leveraging of 130 trillion in private financial services. So really, we're talking really, really big sums here. And the finance is flowing towards a green future and away from a brown future. So what you also heard was a lot of specifics about coal. What would have been great, Michael, would have been a collective agreement to phase out coal and to do away with subsidies for fossil fuels. In the very last dramatic minutes in Glasgow, some of you may have seen it on TV, there was a last minute change in the language to phase down coal. And that's really kind of an important thing for China and India. Hold on just a second, dog coming in. Hold on. Working at home. Sorry, kids and dog. So where were we? Coal, methane, forests, green transportation. I already mentioned finance. Youth showed up again in a powerful way. They were out on the street. Youth were in the conference facility, raising their voices. So I think, again, what was good about COP26, not at all perfect, but what was really good was specifics.
Okay, well, while we fix that problem, maybe some of those countries that wanted to change things got upset and blocked her signal. I'm going to turn to Mauricio, and I'm going to ask. I said that this COP, more than any that has come before it, saw just tremendous activity around cities, especially, but also subnational actors of various sorts. Maybe you could tell us about some of these, because you were heavily involved in many of these agreements.
Thank you so much. Great to be sharing this space with Koko and with Michael. Yes, I think that one of my main takeaways is precisely to witness the increasing role that subnational players are having at COP, which is good news. For example, I saw many more mayors attending this COP than previous ones. I saw many mayors attending COP during World Leaders Day, which was something that was exclusively reserved in the past to heads of state. Now we also have mayors speaking during World Leaders Day. So I think those are concrete signals about how cities and local governments are becoming increasingly relevant players at COP. And that's obvious. Why? Because it is in cities where 70% of total global CO2 emissions are taking place. So it will be impossible for countries to meet their NDCs. It will be impossible for countries to meet the Paris Agreement without an effective role from cities. So it is great to see that cities are being engaged more and more into these kinds of discussions. Now, if you look at the final document from COP, you see some references to subnational governments, regional, local governments, probably not as much as we would have liked. Actually, in the first draft of the document, there was no reference to subnational governance whatsoever, which would have meant a major setback comparing with previous COPs. Fortunately, that was fixed. And finally, we had some important references for subnational governments from the acknowledging the role of subnational governments for meeting the Paris Agreement. Again, not as much as needed, but just like Koko mentioned, this is a process. We need to understand that We cannot do everything overnight. It is a very tough process, but I think that we are making progress in terms of witnessing how cities and local governments in general are being acknowledged as key players for for the definition of climate change. For me, the battle against climate change will be defined in cities. So it is encouraging to see that that is being acknowledged more and more.
Thanks, Mauricio. While we're waiting for Koko, maybe we can talk about the next thing I wanted to ask her, which is one of the things that's very interesting about this COP, again, I think not unique, but at an increased frequency relative to others, was the many, many agreements that weren't formally part of the text. So there were many bilateral agreements, but there were also many agreements like the methane pledge, like a coal pledge. And I just wondered if we could, we have Koko back. So this is a question for Koko and for Mauricio then. So there were many agreements beyond the formal negotiating text. So Koko, you mentioned some of them. There's the forest pledge, the US-China bilateral announcement. There's a methane pledge. There was $130 trillion in climate finance. I guess I wonder, maybe starting with Koko, how does that interact with what's happening actually in the negotiations? So that doesn't become part of the official text, but it seems to play an important role. For example, if you look at the pledges that are officially part of the process, that brings the global mean temperature down to 2.3, 2.4. If you add up everything that anybody said at COP and assume everybody behaves on their absolute best behavior for the next 80 years, then that brings us below 2 degrees for the first time to 1.8. So maybe Koko, you could say something about that, the agreements that are not formally part of the process and the role that the important role they play.
Yeah, thanks so much. And the effect that is sometimes referred to in business literature is a flywheel effect. You have the negotiations happening, bringing together leaders from almost all countries of the world that are making these really tough coordination decisions. And that world stage is also used by many other actors to do bits and pieces of the much bigger work in progress that I referred to just a bit ago. Something that I've learned to very much appreciate about some of the research going on at the University of Pennsylvania on network effects, on social norms. I've been watching our work as long as I've known your work, which is much too little of my life. But I think really what you see is that as governments come together in these different multilateral pledges and commitments, they set a stage and a mood for collaboration and cooperation. So some of those that Mauricio, you mentioned, Michael, that you mentioned, many of those commitments happened right at the beginning of Glasgow. And there is a certain dramaturgy, how do you say that in English? There's a certain kind of staging of these decisions, and it's very human and very, I don't want to say it's mood dependent, but it really does help to get a good, strong start of world leaders basically pointing the direction and saying, we're going there, we're going to net zero, we're going to do it as soon as we can. We will keep 1.5 alive. I know that you've probably all heard of that. And then very early, those world leaders, plus additional mayors and industry, private sector, finance, et cetera, also came together and made all of these commitments. That creates this sense of flywheel, and people start beginning to see a different, wholly possible, really good future, and they lean into it. Maybe the last thing that I would say on this, Michael, is it really is an all hands on deck moment. We've learned that with the Paris Agreement, what we call non-party stakeholders, everyone who's not a country's government, basically, whether it's youth or mayors like you, Mauricio, to school teachers and indigenous people, everyone has a role to play. And in a positive sense, those things came together in Glasgow. It's too early to say, because with a flywheel, you see the change of course a few cycles out, right? And that's why Egypt is going to be the next most important thing. the most important game is the next game. Sometimes people who are in the Little League say, yeah.
Just to highlight a couple of things that you said in passing, Koko. One is, I think, the coal pledge itself obviously sent a signal to markets. So the price of coal just dropped precipitously yesterday morning, which is, really encouraging. So ultimately that's going to drive a lot of things. But also, Koko was talking about the role of, the role of kind of language and concepts that get introduced. So, 1.5 we all know about, but we heard a lot of echoing this COP 98 months, which I think is really useful. Mauricio, if you've heard him speak before, you've no doubt heard 70% of emissions come from cities, and everybody else that works on climate change in this area. So sometimes even just these phrases or words, I think, really give you a sense of where we're going. And it's what Koko said about flywheel effect, but it's also, it helps us kind of together establish more norms and accrete norms together. I think one of the big things that will be happening moving forward is an issue that was once obscure that Koko and I both care a lot about and have worked on a lot, is this issue of loss and damage. So certainly be on the lookout for that. I wanted to ask you, Mauricio, along these lines, the race to resilience is one of the big city initiatives. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, so you mentioned, Michael, before, the important role that non-state players had in this COP. So, and one of the examples of that is precisely the Race to Resilience initiative, which is an initiative promoted by the high-level climate change champions from the UK and from Chile, Nigel Toppin and Gonzalo Muñoz, respectively, whom are fostering the participation of the private sector, civil society, the academia, into developing a framework to build resilience to help 4 billion people by 2030 to be better prepared to face climate risks. There was actually a big pavilion at COP, the Resilience Hub, that gathered many of these non-state players, including, of course, also local and city governments, talking about how to build resilience. And in general, I would like to highlight the importance that adaptation and resilience had at this COP. I think that's something very important to point out, much more than in previous COPs. And I think that that's encouraging because there was a topic that wasn't discussed as much in the past. We can also talk after about specific initiatives that I saw regarding how cities can, build resilience. How can cities face some of the greatest challenges, derived from climate change, like, for example, extreme heat. But going back to your question, yes, I think the Race to Resilience was a clear example of how to engage these other non-state players in a very concrete way with very concrete goals.
Great, and I want to encourage the audience online and also those in the room to start thinking about your questions, because I'm just going to ask, one more question. I have hundreds of questions I could ask, but I'd love to hear yours. So for those in the room, there's a microphone over there. You could begin to line up, but also online, please type them in the box and they'll get sent to me magically on this iPad. I guess, Koko, Mauricio, both of you, you've worked in different areas of diplomacy and of government. A lot of students who are a big part of the in-person audience here often wonder, are the kinds of things that they can do, research, protest, calling government officials, how much, when he gets into the core moments, in the sanctum sanctorum, in the heat of the discussion of the actual negotiations, does any of that penetrate? And Koko, maybe you could start. Do you see the protests and the kind of calling government officials and conceptual work done in universities as actually penetrating into those negotiating rooms?
Yes, absolutely. Starting with what we just experienced, I think it was 48 hours ago, maybe 50, just recently. Absolutely, the citizens on the streets making themselves heard. There were some lighthearted things that go on, like, for example, some NGOs every day give out an award, Fossil of the Day award, and then they kind of, It's a little bit of a sanction, but it is a little bit funny. But really having the youth there in particular, raising their voices, saying what they want, that's just very, very positive. That said, this is a process, and changing hearts and minds, and particularly really big agendas that countries have to defend for their many, many interests at home, that takes time. So I'd even like to bear testimony to the importance of research and networks and action over a period of time. Now, if you're a student and you only have a year and you want to put a fingerprint, then here's how. Find out an area that's really important to you and look at the UNFCCC calendar. Find out your constituency. For you, it's going to be the Ringo constituency. That's research. Michael can show you the front door. And what you want to do is search out the committees that are talking about the things that you're really interested in. So for example, let's say you're a Wharton student and you're really interested in climate finance. You'd want to find out when the first meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance takes place next year. Go, listen, get informed, read a lot, do your homework, read all of the recent decisions, and find out who the committee members are and talk to them and find out what they need. You may even ask a question or prepare a statement together with your peers or with your professors. That's the kind of thing that early in the year unlocks further conversations that mature throughout the year and then have a much greater chance of showing up and being constructive in the end game at COP27 or at whatever COP. So again, some of you have heard me say this before, look at the quarters of the year. And you typically have the committee meetings or constituted body meetings in the first quarter and the third quarter. In the second quarter, that's our mid-year session. All of the decisions are prepared that will ultimately be decided or at least deliberated on at the end of the year. And then at the end of the year, you have a COP. So you have committee, June subsidiary body meetings, those are usually in Bonn. Then you have committee meeting, and then you have the COP. Get involved early, get to know people, ask sincere questions, listen carefully. This is basic civics, and you can absolutely make a really positive contribution. I can give you dozens of examples where individuals and networks have done that.
It's basic civics, but I think UN civics are not the civics that we learn in school. Koko, so
True, fair enough.
And I guess, Mauricio, a similar question. I mean, you were a mayor in addition to now being a climate diplomat and activist. How would you like to work, in your communities with students, with the academic research community? What would be a useful way to engage?
Well, by providing information. I think that it is really important to realize the connection of climate change with the kind of thing that people suffer every day. And let me get into something that Michael, that I've been working very much on, which is extreme heat. That's a very clear example. Extreme heat is the climate-related hazard that kills more people than all other climate hazards combined. And people don't know that. So that's why it is so important to provide information. And why people don't know that? Because extreme heat is a silent killer. It is not visually shocking as a hurricane or as a forest fire, but it kills more people. So it is really important to realize these kind of things and to develop mechanisms to protect our population. And that's something that I found encouraging at this COP. I mean, we saw mayors making very interesting commitments to address extreme heat in their cities, because it is, of course, in cities where extreme heat is more visible, even though it is not as much as needed. But announcements like, for example, the one made by the mayors of Seville and Athens, who are developing a heat wave naming and categorization system. Something very innovative, very disruptive, a system similar to the one that we have for hurricanes. Naming and ranking hurricanes have been in place in the US ever since the 50s. And it has proven to be very effective to raise awareness on the population about these threats and how to better protect themselves. Why not doing the same with heat if heat is killing more people than hurricanes? Last year in the US, heat killed 20 times more people than hurricanes. So it is really encouraging to listen to mayors making these bold, innovative announcements. That's the kind of thing that for me is really exciting to see. But of course, it's a trend that needs to keep on growing. And I think that COP was a good space for that, but of course, much more needs to be done.
Great, thanks, Mauricio. Okay, I have lots more questions, but I want to start turning to the audience. So Sam, first question is yours.
Hi, can you hear me? I'll speak louder. I don't think this is amplifying. I'm not sure this is amplifying my voice. So, oh, now it is. Hello. Hi, I'm Sam. Michael knows me because I'm working with him as a research assistant on a climate and security project. Oh, I'm a senior studying biology. And so in doing that climate security work, I've sort of gotten a good appreciation that there are things that are brought up by climate change that the international community is going to be forced to deal with, that like, you know, that there's second order effects that we wouldn't like to have had to deal with in the first place. In particular, two things that I feel like we haven't really fully engaged with yet are climate migration. We're living in an age where the number of displaced people will scale up a lot, but we're still living with a Holocaust era refugee designation that doesn't admit any of these people, including people whose entire countries will disappear. And geoengineering technology. There are too many different ways that you can try to geoengineer the world, and too many different people who might have a motivation to do that, to put the genie back in the bottle. So, and I'm sure there are other things that I can't think of yet, and people aren't talking about yet, that are also things which will really want international governance as the 21st century moves onward. So as IPCC or UNFCCC experts, framework experts on how the UN is dealing with climate change, do you think that the existing framework is going to be able to govern, to sort of take in these new problems and govern them? Or do you think there's another international framework that will be needed or exists and could do the job? Or do you think that things like that will not be governed and countries will improvise?
Thanks so much. So it's a huge set of questions. So what if we focus on the first part about displacement? And Koko, this is clearly your area of expertise. I wonder if you could say something about displacement and the governance of displacement.
Yeah, a little bit. But actually, Sam, I'll take the whole kit and caboodle because it's too big of a question to actually answer. But I love the question because it points to that good but not good enough yet that I mentioned right at the beginning. We're not, well, how do I say that? We've made some progress with adaptation. The policy area, loss and damage, or these adverse climate impacts, was amplified in a way at this COP like it's never been before. It used to be that would sit in the plenary and would hear one or the other country, maybe a group like LDCs or small island development states, mention loss and damage in passing. But this time, almost without exception, every group and most countries mentioned adverse climate impacts, and even most of them said loss and damage. So that's a start, but what's ahead of us, both for migration as well as geoengineering, is that adverse climate impacts are going to evoke responses. A human response is managing risk. And one way that people manage risk is through their movement on the face of the planet. I really like it, Sam, that you pointed out a really intrinsic idea in dealing with climate impacts, and that is the institutions that were built, a lot of them in the 20th century, were built to address 20th century problems, like the massive movements of people after the tragedy of the Great War and World War II. Terrible. And those institutions arose to help give people stability and protection, and they're really good. They've done a lot of good in the world. And our institutions, be it for the movement of people or for huge experiments with our planet, we do not have adequate institutions in place to govern that scale of transboundary decision-making and coordination. And so this is the work of the century that reaches ahead of us. A lot of the current thinking about adverse climate impacts falls into the realm of humanitarian assistance. Also a good thing, but already rather reactive and very overwhelmed. Already today, there are 4 times as many people displaced from weather-related events as there are from conflict, and that number is growing. So we really need a very strong rethink and orientation to the future. What are the thoughts of our time? What do the institutions need to grow into to be able to maintain peace and stability and a chance at well-being for all of humanity? That's a huge challenge, but it's also for all of you who are some of the brightest and most cooperative and networked. I think this is an exciting time because we're really writing the next century and actually many centuries beyond what we do in this decade, thinking about transboundary issues.
Thanks, Koko. The next question is from Mauricio. So you mentioned the important and increasingly visible role of cities in addressing climate change. Which cities do you see as being at the forefront of the climate movement? Quito, of course, but which ones are lagging behind?
Well, there are several. There are several cities that are doing very interesting things. I just mentioned, Seville and Athens developing this heat wave naming and categorization system. Freetown is a great example in Sierra Leone. Freetown is developing a program called Freetown, the Tree Town, by which they are planting more than 1 million trees to cool down the city. Is a program that addresses both mitigation and adaptation. And it has very interesting mechanisms for community engagement to protect the trees. Very interesting. Miami-Dade County here in the US. The mayor, Daniela Levin Cava, made a very exciting announcement about establishing a heat season next May, just like we have hurricane season. So that kind of things are, again, encouraging. Now, I would like to also mention the issue of finance, because this COP was a lot about finance, which is very important and very positive. Probably it wasn't addressed as everybody was expecting, but there were some interesting announcements and commitments. But I regret the fact that I didn't see as much as what I was expecting regarding cities' access to climate finance. And again, if we all understand the pivotal role of cities to address climate change, we need to provide cities with financial resources to do that. And unfortunately, cities are facing an international financial system that was designed for countries, not for cities. We need to make it more cities friendly. It is estimated that cities will be needing between $4 and $5 trillion to undertake the kind of infrastructure and transformation needed for them to tackle climate change in an effective way. But that will be impossible to achieve through the current system. So we need to undertake bold, disruptive reforms to the international financial system to develop more financial facilities available for cities, particularly in the developing world, where they have not access to this kind of opportunity. So that's the kind of discussions that I think that need to keep on going. Again, COP was a good space for that, but I hope that in Egypt, we will have more concrete results regarding cities' access to climate finance.
Thanks so much, Mauricio. And interestingly, on that point, there was an article this morning in Proceedings in the National Academy of Science that said the long-term study of Boston, 4% of the natural gas is leaking out of the city pipes. So just to give you a sense, methane is this really tremendously dangerous greenhouse gas. I suspect many of you in the audience know that 4% of it's leaking out of the pipes, just not even being used, just totally being lost. So that's the kind of thing, at least in this country, the aging cities will need. Question for Koko. I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to put your economist hat on. $130 trillion. I would have thought, look, I'm a philosopher by training, I don't understand money. I would have thought that's approximately the size of the entire amount of global finance. Like 100 trillion seems about the right order of magnitude. How is $130 trillion available for climate finance? What does that claim that I think we were sitting next to each other when Mark Carney made that? What does that mean?
So 130 trillion is about 40% of the value of, I think, private sector assets worldwide, about 40%. And the key word here is leverage. And so what Mark Carney was talking about at COP26 was a commitment of major financial institutions to use their financial services to encourage movement towards a green economy. That's very tricky. It means some of the things that have happened at the University of Pennsylvania, like looking into what are the funds made out of? Are we investing in coal and fossil fuels or activities that actually undermine a healthy planet? And stepping back from those. You've got pension funds, very, very large pension funds that are trying to move more and more away. They're first trying to clarify what parts of their portfolio traditionally have been in fossil fuels or other types of activities that generate greenhouse gas emissions, and back away from those and shift the trillions. And that's in some way where that phrase comes from, shifting the trillions. And that's a really big kind of lever. What we're going to see is whether or not that lever really works. So stay tuned in the next year or two. This thing that you said, Michael, about the price of different commodities, coal is one of them. Watch the price of commodities. Also, watch what boards decide. There's greater, hopefully, a move towards greater transparency. It will not be easy. And I think that there's also going to be a need for great sensitivity towards the needs of people who are on the short end of the stick, because this kind of shift doesn't come without winners and losers, saying it in that really nasty economist way. So we're going to have to be very careful and sensitive and quick. Those aren't easy things to do.
Thanks, Koko. There's a bunch of questions. I see. There's a bunch of, very next question. There's a bunch of questions having to do with the role of smaller countries. And I was going to ask Mauricio a question, and I can comment because I negotiated for the Republic of Maldives. But I know you didn't join COP as a representative of the Ecuadorian government. In fact, Mauricio joined as a representative of the University of Pennsylvania. But I wondered if you could just comment a little bit about smaller countries or countries in Latin America, their role more generally in this process, the kind of moral authority that countries like your own have in this process, some of the kinds of announcements that President Lasso made, maybe.
No, I think we saw very exciting announcements from different developing world countries, including Latin American ones, particularly regarding biodiversity protection. As you know, some of these countries are the richest in the world regarding biodiversity. And I think that, this is the kind of discussion that should be having more attention at COP. The engagement with developed countries into the biodiversity conservation agenda, I think is key. So I think that primarily the role of developing countries has been regarding that kind of thing. I mean, we all know that developing countries haven't been the responsible for most emissions historically. We have heard from Koko about the loss and damage scheme and how it was expected that there was going to be more concrete outcomes regarding some commitments from the developed world from the developed world with developing countries regarding this. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but I hope to see that happening during next COP. And in that regard, I think that several, specifically Latin American presidents, made important announcements about their commitment to protect nature and to undertake a very serious climate agenda.
Mm-hmm. I can just add, I can't speak for the Republic of Maldives, although I was on their negotiating team, but lots of disappointment on the part of especially small island developing states, because there has been a hope that there would be more financing available for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And so what the positive, though, is that I think it's much more in the center of the discussion. But just to give you a sense, for Maldives, the country that's a meter above sea level, that's the average elevation of the country. And a lot of the economy is based in tourism, and a lot of that tourism is based on the reefs. At 1.5 even, the reefs are in big trouble, And at 2 degrees, there's almost certainly going to be complete catastrophic loss of coral reefs all around the world. So
It's actually estimated at 1.2 degrees.
already at 1.2, yeah. I mean, the conservative numbers, right? So, but by 2, let's say, it's really bad. So yeah, I mean, you can see that small countries have a big role to play, also have a lot of voice. After the session, if you want to talk to Mike Franzig over there, he's a historian of diplomacy. He can tell you it's very unusual, in fact, that smaller countries have so much of an influence in the kind of decision. But it is, I mean, that's the stakes, right? For, we really need to be very quick and very, very serious to address these issues. We have a question from the floor, please.
Hi, I'm Kimberly Narona. I'm a PhD student.
You need to just tilt the microphone up a little bit. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you tilt it?
Yeah.
Like that.
Better?
Yeah, much better.
I'm Kimberly Narona. I'm a PhD student with City and Regional Planning. My question is, I'm hoping to tilt the conversation slightly. It's not that the climate, a lot of what we see in terms of the conversation and the lexicon of terms on climate change is that this is an event that needs to be prevented, mitigated, adapted for. There's an implicit understanding that if we do these things, it won't happen. But the reality that a lot of us are living in is that climate is changing. It's a present continuous rather than a noun. And if we think about it in this way, how going forward can we change the conversation at these different levels that you were talking about, the different circles of conversation? Because for me, the biggest disappointment of the COP26 agreement is that it, as with all international agreements, it tried to make too many people happy and keep everybody from fighting, as opposed to actually thinking about what would be effective change. And Mauricio's point on disrupting the conversation, I think, is important. But just thinking about heat is just one way of saying, okay, now this is how we're living with climate change. How could people at the UN, academics, policymakers change this conversation to something that is actually happening on the ground? Second, very quick question is, how do we change the way that people at these talks start thinking about the developing world and the developed world as gradations of possibilities rather than 2 big chunks?
Mm-hmm.
Because you've got cities, like for example, the Quito, for example, has much more capability than some very small cities, which is 500 people. And if you're going to look at cities as the unit of action and therefore finance, which is extremely important, how do you then target within this changing framework? Thank you.
These are extremely rich questions. Maybe, Mauricio, do you want to take a little piece of the end of that, and then maybe I can redirect a piece of the beginning of that to Koko?
Let me take the second piece of the question. I think that's a very important point, Kimberly. The kind of challenges that medium and small size cities are facing are huge. As we know, it is medium and small cities in the developing world, particularly in Asia and Africa, the ones that will be growing the most in terms of population during the next few years. And those cities really, really lack the capacity, for the most part, to access to finance, to undertake, again, the kind of infrastructure transformation needed to tackle climate change. And it's not only a problem of lack of institutional capacity on the cities, a lack of project preparation capacity to develop bankable projects that would be able to, receive finance. It is not only a regulatory problem that many cities have to have, the kind of needed access to international finance, because they have to face a lot of obstacles, but it is also the fact that many mayors, and not only in medium and small cities, but in all cities, unfortunately, many mayors still don't take a climate agenda as a political sexy one, particularly the kind of adaptation-related actions, because they don't see them as politically sexy. And I think we need to change the rhetoric. I think that we need to provide these mayors with the kind of message needed for them to communicate the population that undertaking adaptation measures, it's not only about being or not politically sexy, but about saving people's lives. That's what we're talking about. And the highest priority that any public official should have is to protect the population. And you do that through undertaking resilience and adaptation related measures. So that's the kind of support that I think that international organizations, UN agencies, the academia, civil society can provide to mayors around the world to make them realize the importance of undertaking these kinds of actions.
Maybe just as our final question, I can ask Koko, is 1.5 still alive?
I think some of the high-level speakers right at the end said 1.5 is alive and it has a weak heartbeat. Everything that we do everything that we always do is important, right? It's almost like a philosophical thing. As long as we're living, we have a heartbeat. But what's going to be really important is that all of us work together in our own capacities. And I loved what you said, Kim, the gradations of possibility and effective change that actually is operationalizable. You said it in a more elegant way. But the changes that must be made have to move now from an incredibly intense conversation and goodwill and a lot of disappointment into action. If we miss action for whatever reasons, and most likely no fault of our own, we're going to be in big trouble, because as many of us are already experiencing, we're not at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And this summer in North America for several weeks, you had daytime temperatures of at or just above or just below 50 degrees Celsius in Canada. There were 40 to 60 million people under that heat dome. It may be in the future that our cities go underground. It may be that animal husbandry completely changes, but all forms of life have evolved. Actually, that's not true, but humans have evolved in the more or less the Holocene in the last some millions of years. Or if you don't think about evolution, you can just say, we've been here in the Holocene. And in order to maintain healthy ecosystems and healthy societies, we genuinely need to make that change. That's why 1.5 and keeping it very much on our radar screen and making sure that we don't overshoot it in this decade is absolutely essential. Glasgow was a success and the road unfolds ahead of us, and it's more work ahead for all of us.
I just wanted to thank both of our speakers. We're handing it back to LaShawn and tell you there are many, many more wonderful climate-related discussions to be had in this building over the rest of the semester and the rest of the year. So please do join us for all those things. And I turn it back to my colleague, LaShawn Jefferson.
Can you all hear me okay? Is this mic live?
Yes.
So thank you for coming today. And I really want to emphasize that your time is valuable and you spent it with us, that we appreciate it and that we hope to see you here again. I want to spend a moment, obviously, thanking Mauricio, Michael, and Koko for what I think has been a deeply honest and reflective panel on the road ahead and on what all of our collective responsibility is about climate change and demystifying COP26 in some ways, that there's this like process going on in Scotland, and most people were not there for it, but you've been able to get a taste of it here and to see what it implies about you and about your future and about our own collective action. So I do want to take a moment and give our panelists a round of applause.